Hello, my name is Colleen Humes, and the topic of my presentation will be about the dioxin exposure in Times Beach, Missouri. Objectives of this presentation will be to understand the history of events that led to the contamination, learn about the toxicology of dioxin, look at the ecological and possible health effects on the community of Times Beach, and discuss the after effects of the Times Beach disaster and where the town stands today. I want to briefly explain the Times Beach tragedy that occurred before we dive into the environmental and health data that were collected. In the 1970s, a waste oil hauler named Russell Bliss was hired to remove a chemical named dioxin that was stored at a chemical facility in Missouri. Bliss uses the dioxin to mix it with the waste oil and uses it for dust suppression on dirt roads and horse tracks all throughout Missouri, which included the town of Times Beach. Soon after, children and animals fell ill as a result of the sprayed dirt roads, and federal government mobilizes resources to investigate the dioxin contamination. In December of 1982, record flooding from the Merrimack River sweeps the town of Times Beach. Residents of the town were forced to evacuate due to the fear of the flood spreading the dioxin. In February of 1983, the EPA tested dioxin levels in Times Beach and found out that the levels were 300 times what the CDC considers safe. Residents were permanently relocated, and the town was deemed unsafe to be re-inhabited. Throughout the 1990s, the state of Missouri and the EPA worked together to excavate and incinerate 37,234 tons of dioxin-contaminated materials from Times Beach. The cleanup was completed in 1997. In the 1980s until the early 2000s, there were multiple long and extensive steps that the EPA had to do to ensure the proper cleanup and removal of dioxin at Times Beach. The Superfund was created to address environmental contamination and authorizes short-term removals of contaminants and long-term remedial responses that require more permanent reduction of the threat or release of hazardous substances. The timeline below shows the major milestones of the complex and multi-phase process of removing dioxin from Times Beach. What are dioxins? Dioxins are a group of toxic chemical compounds that are known as persistent organic pollutants, or POPs. POPs take a long time to break down in the environment. What makes dioxins toxic is the chlorines in the 2, 3, 7, and 8 positions at the phenyl rings. Dioxins are formed as a result of the combustion process, such as waste incineration and burn-in fuels. The production of Agent Orange, which was famously used in the Vietnam War, causes the TCDD byproduct, which should be stored in the chemical facilities. The EPA has classified TCDD as Group B2, meaning it is a probable human carcinogen. It can also cause other reproductive and developmental problems, as well as immune system damage and hormonal interference. Scientists at the CDC concluded that residential soils greater than 1 part per billion of TCDD pose a level of concern based on the risk assessment at Times Beach. There are 3 possible pathways of human exposure: direct contact with soil, ingestion of soil, and inhalation of the contaminated dust. We can see from the table that the concentration of dioxin in the soil at Times Beach range from 1 to 1,200 parts per billion, which at these concentrations can cause a higher risk of developing cancer and other serious illnesses. In the report, scientists compared dioxin levels in Missouri to Seveso, Italy, another town that was contaminated with dioxin via a chemical cloud from a factory. The contaminated oil that was caused in Missouri left a high concentration of dioxin in the soil than the chemical cloud in Seveso. Laboratory testing in the study also confirmed that dioxin is insoluble in water and binds tightly to soil. A study looked at the TCDD levels in abdominal adipose tissue of residents in Missouri who believed were exposed to the toxin. So there is the control group, and then you have the exposed group, which was divided into 3 categories. The first was recreational, which was those who were riding or caring for horses in TCDD-contaminated stable arenas. Residential, which were those that were living in areas with TCDD-contaminated soil or having evidence of contamination inside the home. And lastly, occupational, which was working either in a hexachlorophene production facility or at truck terminals where the grounds had been sprayed with TCDD. Individuals who had occupational exposure had the highest mean levels of dioxin in their adipose tissue, which makes up 53% of the total sample population. This could be due to a lack of personal protective equipment given to employees at the hexachlorophene production facilities and the truck terminals. The second highest mean levels were from the recreational exposure from the horse stables, which made up 36% of the total sample population. Part of the CDC's assistance of the Times Beach cleanup, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health was requested by the Missouri Department of Natural Resources to evaluate the debris cleanup contractor's health and safety program. The personnel on the site were divided into the following categories: technicians, open cab operators, close operators, truck drivers, and site supervisors. The total dust air samples were collected from each worker's breathing zone during their work cycle. The results were generally ranged from 0.28 to 6.98 milligrams per meter cubed, which was attributed to the different tasks that were being performed and the weather. From January 12th to the 14th, the roads and debris were wet, and from January 18th to the 20th, the roads were dry. The wet roads in the first week seemed to reduce the amount of dust that was in the workers' breathing zone across all categories compared to the second week. The technicians had the highest amount of dust exposure due to the work duties that they were performing. It was also noted that many workers did not have adequate PPE that did not properly fit. Concerns regarding whether living in the vicinity of the hazardous waste incinerator during the Times Beach cleanup increased TCDD levels in humans. A prospective cohort study was conducted with residents that lived near the incinerators. The study area chosen was within a 4-kilometer radius of the Times Beach incinerator, and the comparison area was within a minimum of 15 kilometers from the incinerator. The participants had blood drawn prior to incineration, 4 months into incineration, and 11 months later when the incineration process was completed. The results showed that the participants for both the study area and comparison area had significant decrease in serum TCDD levels from prior to incineration to post-incineration. It is interesting to note that although the study area had a higher mean serum level at round 1, that by round 3, the mean serum levels were at the same concentration as the comparison area, which is 1.23 parts per trillion. As you can see, Times Beach today looks very different from the Times Beach 30 years ago, as seen from the aerial views taken on the left and right by the U.S. Geological Survey. A town full of homes is now replaced by the trees. After the cleanup was completed, the state of Missouri turned the town into the now Route 66 State Park. The state park still has a few reminders of Times Beach, which include a mound that has the incinerated buildings and belongings of the people that used to live there. In conclusion, the Times Beach disaster was a result of major flooding that spread the dioxin throughout the town. This was placed due to oil spraying of the dirt roads. Multiple steps by the EPA and the CDC helped to remove and incinerate tons of dioxin-contaminated soil and the buildings.